And we're live on The Dictators on Friday, May 15th, 2026. Before we get started, I just want to say that to acknowledge my absence from The Dictators and my own podcast for a few days. I've actually had to take care of some family medical issues, and I still may actually have to take care of those. So no guarantees on my participation, but I'm here now, and hopefully that won't change. In any event, we have a return guest that Jonathan and I have spoken with privately and separately, but we've never had him on with us together on The Dictators. So I'm really happy to do that. Brief introduction before we have him speak. It's Nicolas Tenzer is our very special guest today. He's a senior fellow with the Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. He's also currently a guest professor at the Paris School for International Affairs, also known as PSIA Sciences Po. His current interests and writings are heavily focused on political risk analysis, European issues, Russia and Ukraine, disinformation warfare, the Middle East, U.S. foreign policy, human rights, and corruption. And he was previously also an advisor to some senior officials in France. And as I said, we are thrilled to have him here on The Dictators. Nicolas, welcome.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Jonathan, to join.
You bet. Very, very glad to have you here. Let me get right into it. For those of you who don't know, Jonathan is currently in Lviv, Ukraine, and I wanted to reference Nicolas's most current article in the Kyiv Post, where he appears regularly as well as other publications. And the title of the article is Return Number 7, his seventh visit from Ukraine, the rational power of a great nation, with a subtitle that I love, which is The Inevitable Demise of a Pathetic Country, Russia. I just want to say before you get going, the United States is going through a very, very rough time, and I believe that our democracy is critically wounded right now, and will take a very long time, if ever, to come back. However, we have done some great things. We have been a great democracy that has contributed a lot of positive things to the world. Russia, on the other hand, has never been a democracy. They've never been a great country, and they've never contributed anything positive to the world. On the contrary, they've been a leech, and they've sucked a lot of positive things from the world, and they continue to do so. On that positive note, Nicolas, could you tell us a little bit about the reason that you wrote the article, and a little bit, maybe some excerpts and your main thesis?
Well, basically, that was a piece, basically on my Substack blog. And then that, like many of them, of course, it has been also republished by the Kyiv Post. And that's indeed my seventh trip to Ukraine since February 24th, 2022. Of course, that's probably my 25th visit to Ukraine since 20 years. And I was there, like each year since 10, to participate, to speak at the Kyiv Security Forum. And that was also the opportunity to launch the translation of my book, Or War, Crime and Oblivion, in Ukrainian. That was also for me very, very, very moving time, I must say, because, of course, this book was mostly intended to be read by the Ukrainian readers. And there are many of them, because I am always convinced, and that's some things that I can observe each time I come back to Ukraine, the appetite of the Ukrainian people for books, for reading, for information. 2 years ago, I was especially in the book fair in the Arsenal in Kyiv, and there were many crowds of people lining to enter the festival of books. So I think you have in Ukraine a country that really is a kind of model for European countries. That's something that I wrote many times, also, in my piece. And then at the end of it, this part was not republished by the Kyiv Post, but I am insisting on, the intellectual life, in Ukraine, and the way the Ukrainian people are rediscovering their own past, their great writers, their painters, their sculptors, their artists in general. That's part of the traditions of Ukraine. And there is actually in Ukraine a kind of historical consciousness that most of the European countries, not even talking about the US, has lost. And what I observed also this time in Ukraine is that there is more, I will say, optimisms and convictions that at the end of the day, hope it will come soon, they will win the war. And I think that we have to come back to what exactly I mean or we mean by ending the war, or basically being absolutely victorious in this war. They're absolutely convinced that, I don't know when, no one knows when. In fact, I mean, the Russian troops will have to withdraw from the Ukrainian territories. That's something that already, was said by a very senior official of the Ukrainian government already, 2.5 years ago. At the end of the day, they will basically be able to win a kind of strategic autonomy, because the Ukrainian people observe something, and even the strike that we were witnessing yesterday that killed 24, in Kiev, and many others, unfortunately, since February 24th, or even before since 2014. Basically, I think that they will defend Ukraine and they will win by their own. Of course, we have the European countries and the US before Trump delivering a lot of weapons to Ukraine, but never enough, never the decisive weapons. And I remember that some things that I also said, on February 24th, 2022, I was invited, in many talk shows, in French television, also in television in Switzerland and Belgium, etc. I think, okay, we have to take action ourselves. But in fact, no country decided to join the fight. They hadn't, in mind these principles that we have to know for sure that we never win a war if we refuse to fight it. And they refuse to fight, the European countries and the US and others.
Of course. Yeah,
but the Ukrainians will do. The Ukrainians are doing. They are basically protecting the front line, not only of Ukraine, but the front line of Europe. They are fighting the war that we are not willing to fight.
Yes.
And ultimately, they will triumph. Because the capabilities that they have, technical capabilities, strategic acumen, is something really exceptional. And I think, of course, this country not only deserve to be in Europe and to join NATO, that's my view completely obvious, but that will be a tremendous asset for Europe and for NATO if Ukraine is finally allowed to do so. Because that's only the best countries in terms of strategic capabilities, but also in terms of, I will say, strategic mindset that we right now have in Europe. Sorry, I was a little bit long.
Yeah, no, you are echoing things that Jonathan and I both believe and have said many, many times.
The joke here is that NATO needs to be invited to join Ukraine, not the other way around. And actually, there's more and more evidence that this is absolutely the case. We had the maritime exercises, we had the land-based exercises in which Ukrainian drone operators and tech decimated in these tests NATO forces. I want to pick up on something you said there, because even if Ukraine wins the war, and we need to define that. I mean, for Ukrainians, it's clear it's the recovery of their sovereign territories. That doesn't mean, does it, that Russia ceases to be a threat. In fact, that threat mutates in other forms. But I get the impression that in Europe, Britain especially, even amongst those who are aware there's a war still going on, they seem to presume that once it's over, it's over. Whereas to my mind, the threat to Europe grows following Ukrainian victory. It doesn't necessarily diminish. What are your thoughts?
First of all, I couldn't agree more. I think that basically the Russian threat is here to stay, and that we must absolutely have a long-term strategy towards Russia. And by a long-term strategy towards Russia, it means not only that once Ukraine will win, we will have certainly to continue or sanctions policy, we must absolutely will have to make Russia pay, which is, in my view, a long-term process. And by long-term process, I mean that not only the frozen assets of the Russian central bank, which is about 300 billion euros, that we will have certainly to transfer to Ukraine, but even this amount is not enough. It means that the allies will have to say to the Russians, well, during the next, let's say, 10 years or 15 years, you will have to pay the full reparations to the Ukrainian people, which probably is an amount about, 1,000 or even more $1 billion or billion euros. They will have to do that. And then there will be no return to normalcy with Russia as long as all the criminals, I mean both the sponsors, the executioners, and the propagandists, are not brought to court. They will have to be brought to court. And so we have to intensify our pressures on Russia during the decades to come, in order, of course, to diminish the threat coming from Russia. I am not talking that we will have certainly immediately to denuclearize Russia. That could sound a kind of utopia, certainly, if we just say that right now. But we certainly will have to exert this kind of pressure for Russia to understand that it cannot threaten their neighbors without appropriate consequences. And the issue is that if you consider, the mood in the capitals, in Europe, but also, of course, in the US, and not talking only about Trump's administration, I will say with President Biden or even President Obama, that would have been exactly the same. There is absolutely no long-term view. They don't have long-term view on Russia. They don't have probably long-term view on China or Iran or any other countries. That's a fact. That's a real problem of strategic thinking that we are facing, in most of the Western capitals. But I think that they must have this kind of long-term view. Of course, I don't know what will be the future of Russia, in 30 years from now or 40 years from now. I mean, no one can know. But that's something that I am always referring to, which is my view very important. You remember German President Richard von Weizsäcker on May 8th, 1985, so 40 years after 1945, said, well, very fortunately, we have been defeated. And for the decades to come, Germany will have to carry on the burden of the collective guilt for all the crimes committed on behalf of the German people. I don't know if it will happen in Russia with one president of Russia saying this kind of thing. But as long as we don't have a president of Russia willing to say that everyone in Russia, not only the criminals that I was talking about just before, but everyone has basically to carry on this burden of the guilt, Russia won't be a free nation and will continue to be a threat to its neighbors.
Nicolas, I want to play a couple of brief clips from someone who expresses your views at least as good as you do. Then I have they're very brief, and then I have a follow-up question for you, if you could.
When you are witnessing a crime of genocide, in accordance with the conventions of December 9th, 1948 on the prevention and repression of the crime of genocide, you cannot remain silent and passive. There is a duty to intervene. There is a duty to take action. And because, most of the politicians in the West do not want to take action, they are just refraining, talking about it. That's a kind of perversion. Just imagine that you giving up part of the Ukrainian territories, part of Donbass, or Donbass as a whole, or Crimea. I think the situations in terms of security will be worse for the Ukrainians and for the Europeans as well, because there will be a possibility for the Russians to recruit some troops. You have 1.6 million Ukrainian young people living in those occupied territory, and they will be used as cannon fodder by the Russian troops. Just imagine that we are giving in, for instance, Crimea. You have Sevastopol, you have the Russian fleet, of the Black Sea that will come back because they were expelled by the Ukrainians. Just imagine that you have all the sanctions lifted. Russia will be certainly more dangerous, at that time.
So my question, Nicolas, for you is to follow up on what you just said in person and in your previous clips. Do you believe there's any possibility of long-term peace between Europe, including Ukraine and Russia, unless the current regime and the current mindset of the Russian people is totally, I won't say destroyed, but how can I say altered to view the world as the rest of Europe does, not as an enemy, but as part of a united world? Is there any chance of that, or does this nation have to be razed to the ground, whether economically and or militarily, for that to happen?
Well, I will say that unfortunately, certainly not. I mean, as far as Russia is not, I will say, fully defeated and is not willing to change its mindset, the very idea of as we said before, peaceful coexistence with Russia is just impossible. So it means that basically we will have to weaken Russia. That's the only solution. Of course, it will take a long time, but we will have to finish the job. And finish the job means basically weaken Russia. And when Russia will be very severely weakened and damaged, then maybe the people will understand, maybe, I have absolutely no certainty about that, there could be a kind of regime change, and the Russians will be able to come to terms with, their past crimes during the Stalinist period, during the Putinist period, etc. And so we will have certainly to live with this burden, in the next decades to come. The only question that I have, I wouldn't say that I am fully optimistic about that, is if the Western leaders or the next American leaders will understand this reality. Because many of them just look at many people still talking about, we'll have to engage Russia, we'll have to talk to Russia. Of course, we know the threat coming from Russia, but certainly we'll have to find a kind of peaceful solutions because of etc., etc. They are not understanding the reality of the Russian power and the reality of the Russian mindset and the reality of the Russian society right now. Even, there was many reports on that, even, part of the intellectual elite, in Moscow, and some of the leaders of the opposition right now, with some exceptions like Kasparov and others who perfectly understand the situation, many of them do not accept that this kind of imperial mindset or this kind of murderous mindset, is still remaining, in their minds and souls. That will be something that we cannot just, cancel, with words or in a few days. That will be a long-term process. But if, especially the Russian oppositions, is not doing properly this work and said, okay, it's Putin of its cronies, but it's not the Russian people. They won't understand the reality of the depths of the perversions of the Russian mind. Of course, it's not the question of DNA. I don't think that there is a DNA of the Russian people or something like that, but that's, of course, the legacy of their own history during 100 years or even more.
I agree. And I really, it upsets me. I'll say this, repels me when people keep calling this Putin's war, because this is the people's war. Whether or not it's in their DNA, I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but I do know, as you said, it's in their culture, going back hundreds of years. As you just referenced, imperial mindset. I believe they think this is their destiny. to do this. And how dare Ukraine try to stand up for its independence when Russia says that you're part of us, you're Slavs, you should worship the Kremlin and Putin. So I think, as you said, this is a multi-generational thing. I don't know the answer, Nicholas. All I know is it's not a short-term solution. And the expatriates, the refugees from Russia that, like you said, that still don't get that. They still don't get that mindset, that it's an imperial mindset. One last question. I know Jonathan's got a bunch of them.
I'm itching for one, yeah.
Well, yeah. Last question. Do you believe that Europe gets it finally, the European leaders, or are they still dragging their feet?
Well, I mean, it's quite difficult because which is true is that on the one hand, most of the European leaders, Merz, Macron, Starmer, and others, acknowledge that there is a true Russian danger that is here to stay. They are talking right now, they didn't in the past, talking openly about the crimes, the mass crimes, without any kind of statute of limitations, perpetrated by the Russians. And I remember when I was warning about the Russian threats 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, after 2014, or before 28, I mean the Georgian thing. People just consider me a kind of fool, a kind of warmongers, a kind of excessive person, etc., etc. They didn't even pay attention to people like me and some others. I was not fully alone. Were just warning about this. No, they know that. But on the other hand, that's why I'm quite often talking about a kind of cognitive dissonance. They are very they have some problems acknowledging the fact that Russia right now is a kind of radical evil and was launching an all-out war that aims at destroying Ukraine, Georgia, and the fact that there is a genocidal war going on in Ukraine, they do not dare using the term genocide. Because, as I said in the video, if there is a genocide, there is a DQ to take action. They do not grasp that. And that's why they are still talking about peace talks, peace. And I think that basically the very word of peace is something that unfortunately must be banished from the wording of the European people. They will have to talk about victory of Ukraine, they will have to talk about defeat of Russia, but the very idea that they will have to build something like a kind of new architecture of security or etc. It's just nonsense. It shows that, and I think there is maybe a psychological reason for that, because they do not want to face the kind of war that their parents or grandparents were facing during the Second World War. They are not acknowledging that basically, and I have a whole chapter of my book about that whatever the differences, and there are a lot of historical differences, etc., Putin and Hitler are playing on the same ground. That's basically, they are the two faces, with of course Stalin, Mao, and some others, that are exactly the same kind of people, with which just any kind of discussions, not even talking about negotiation, is not possible. Because that's a kind of abyss. And they are afraid of facing this kind of abyss.
As you say, it comes with responsibility. Once you acknowledge it, then to not act creates, it potentially puts people in the frames for prosecutions and moral condemnation and so on. But it also seems that, and this is Vladimir Ermolenko and someone I interviewed after Dron last week talk a lot about this, is that we have something which is an abstract European humanism, which is in itself not a bad thing necessarily, but it forces us to not acknowledge the evil that Russia is perpetuating, that it demands that we actually have sympathy for the aggressor, which Ukrainians don't, and they know that it's a dangerous thing to sympathize with your aggressor in a very abstract way. But we also have moved away from the idea of individual heroism. Heroism after the Second World War, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, became quite institutionalized, more abstract, and we took it away from the idea of individual sacrifice and heroism. Ukrainians don't suffer from that, and they've got direct evidence now that actually you have to acknowledge there are such things as heroes, and your resistance depends on it. How on earth are we going to relearn this and relearn to defend ourselves after maybe decades, as almost of neutralization of this idea of defense, heroism, and having values that are real and genuine, or at least we have to treat them as such rather than sort of relative and postmodern?
Well, I think that's a very, very long story in a way, because there are different things here. In my view, there are two things. The first thing is that most of the, I will say, foreign policy analysts refuse to integrate in their assessment, I mean, strategic assessment, security assessment, something very concrete, very sharp, the questions of evil and the questions of morality. I am not a kind of idealist. I consider myself a realist in a way. But in my view, to understand the very nature of crime and the fact that crimes, such as the crimes perpetrated by Russia during the Chechnya war, is heralding and signaling something. As I wrote, the crime is the message. And the crime is a kind of strategic message about, the very purpose of intentions of what Russia, maybe some other countries as well, are preparing to do in concrete terms. The second thing is, and that's something I am very much afraid, in many European countries, of course in the US and some others, that also the foreign policy analysts refuse to integrate in their thoughts the questions of international law. Because you have right now, most of the people, even, the leaders of the free countries consider that, well, international law, that's good, that's great, okay, we have to comply with, etc. But it seems to be something abstract in the eyes that has nothing to do with strategy. And when we see, the attempts to dismantle also the rule of law in some of the European countries and the US right now with Trump, I am very afraid of the fact that, well, international law could be considered not something mandatory, but a kind of option. Okay, if we can implement the international law, enforce the international law, okay, that's good. But if we cannot, well, we cannot. And you observed a lot of criticisms, in the European countries against the judges, in Strasbourg or in Luxembourg, the judges of the European Union Court of Justice or the European Council of Human Rights. Not even talking, about, the International Criminal Court, with also the prosecution of the judges, or some judges of it, by the Trump administration, which is absolutely not acceptable. So, we are facing, in my view, the dismantlement of the very principles that were at first enacted during the Nuremberg trial. And that's why, I am very suspicious about, the ability of the European leaders and American leaders, not only talking about Trump, to grasp that what we call international order or international security is something that has to be fully comprehensive. And that the question of rule of law and rule of, let's say, international law, it's something that is basically something that must, in a way, achieve and complete, the building of international order. And that's why when you have a lot of countries, and not only Russia actually, violating, in plain sight, the international law, and I think there must be no double standards about that. I am very afraid about the understanding by those leaders of the core of the international security and the international order.
David.
Jonathan, yeah, I had a follow-up on that, which is my opinion, to follow up what you just said, Nicolas, is that to my mind, not being a diplomat, is that the individual European countries are still, even in this situation, loath to give up their individual fiefdoms, their individual defense budgets, their economic policies, all of the power that they hold locally. They are loath to give that up to an international order, even to a European order, and be part of something that involves 28 or 32 different European nations. They still want to operate as an independent kingdom, even in the face of this existential danger. Do you agree with that, or do I somehow still not get it?
No, I fully, first of all, I fully agree with that. There is absolutely no solidarity. I mean that, of course, in some of the statements by the European leaders, they say, okay, we have to move toward European defense. We have to spend more for our defense. We have certainly to reach the 5%. And actually, I think that if we want to replace the US, it's not 5% of the GDP, but probably 6 or 7, according to some studies. But they are not basically understanding that, the critical mass must be and is only European. I will say even more than European. European plus, of course, the UK, plus Norway, plus I would say Canada, and probably we'll have some things that I was advocating in my last book, The End of Great Powers Politics. We have certainly to build a kind of alliance with host country, plus Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Australia, and maybe some African countries and some Latin American countries as well. We will have certainly to do this kind of thing, which is, in my view, absolutely critical. But if we are basically hiding, in a way, to the public opinion in Europe, that we will have to face a long-term threat and that the war won't be over when we will have Ukraine's victory, as we were discussing before. There will be a huge pressure from the public opinion saying, okay, Ukraine is victorious right now, so Russia is not a threat. Or China, is visited not only by Mr. Trump, but also by many of the European leaders. We'll have to build something with China. And then, we'll have to devote the budget to the hospital, to schools, to the railways, to the roads, etc. And that's something I'm really afraid of, because if we have this kind of, let's say, peace agreement, or even ceasefire, or even victory of Ukraine, people will say, no, we must not rearm. And the solidarity between the European nations, which is very imperfect, but that we are still, in a way, striving to build, will be no more.
Nicolas, why isn't this solidarity there? That's the key trillion-dollar question. Why? I mean, I know the leaders get it. I mean, their military, their intelligence agencies tell them what's going on, the existential threat by Russia, and that they must support Ukraine and defend themselves. Why don't they still get that? Why are they still, why is the solidarity not happening?
Well, for me, it's, as you say, that's, $1 billion questions in a way. And I
or
don't
trillion,
have
The American defense budget, $1.5 trillion.
Yes, even more. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't have. I mean, unfortunately, I don't have. I mean, a very convincing answer. That's why I was talking about cognitive dissonance just before. Yes. On the one hand, they're saying something, but on the other hand, they are not willing to take action. Let's give you just a small example, which is the very idea that I was supporting of Sky Shield. Sky Shield, which is basically the idea that we have basically to close the Ukrainian skies and just prevent any kind of missile, drone, etc., to reach the Ukrainian territory. It's not a costly solution. It doesn't even implicate that we down Russian aircrafts. It's not, as we say, I don't like the word, escalatory. No, but they are still refusing to do so. And for me, that's a kind of, not only it's not understandable, but in my view, it's a kind of guilt by the European leaders. Guilt because there were thousands, if not dozens of thousands of Ukrainian people that we could have saved. And basically, Europe and the US, even during Biden tenures, were not willing to do so. They didn't want to save people.
Jonathan, I know you've got to leave fairly soon. Do you want to jump in before you have to take off?
Yes, I'm popping off now. I wanted to send my gratitude to Nicolas for joining, and I look forward to having another conversation about his book, which I really want to, push to my audience, to the Anglo-Saxon audience, or as the Russians call it, the cursed Anglo-Saxons. I think it's important to get those thoughts out and show that there's a strong strain of European thought that is about defense and about Ukrainian victory. For now, I just want to say thank you, and I'm gonna jump off.
Thank you, Jonathan. Nicholas, stick around for a couple of minutes if you could. And Jonathan's got to go defend the Western world. So. Okay, so Nicholas, again, I also just want to echo what Jonathan said, which is to thank you for being here. And again, I think this is the $1 trillion question, which is the Europeans' reluctance, refusal, in my opinion, the leadership. This comes down to leadership. Or am I wrong? Are the European citizens, the people who live in Western Europe, I'm going to exclude Eastern Europe because I think they're fully aware of the threat that Russia poses. Are the populations of Western Europe forcing the leaders of the Western European nations to spend more money still on the safety nets, the healthcare, bridges, roads, and so forth, all of which are critical, but are they forcing them to still spend their tax dollars on infrastructure as opposed to defense and innovation to protect against the Russian threat? Or is it just a lack of will encouraged by their leaders?
I in my view, that's basically the second hypothesis that you were mentioning. Because in fact, when I am giving conferences, in France and some other countries, meeting with, let's say, ordinary people, I mean, not intellectual or foreign policy strategists, people basically understand the threat. And they know about, the Ukrainian sufferings. Of course, not all of them, but many of them. And even if you see the opinion surveys, especially in France, but not only in France, you have a majority of people considering Russia a threat. They are now considering the US a threat as well, I must say, with Trump. But they are considering Russia a threat. They are considering that, of course, Ukraine is right. And they are basically perfectly aware of the danger posed by Russia. But you have, in my view, a real problem, which is a leadership problem, as you rightly said. If the leaders of the European countries, and especially Western Europe countries, are not talking day after day about what happened in Ukraine, if they are not talking precisely about the crime, even, showing the images of the children killed, if they are not advertising in a way about the deportation of children, etc., etc., if they are not giving enough examples of the concrete threats posed by Russia, like sabotage, assassination attempts, etc., people, well, basically cannot understand. So I think that the Western leaders have to talk day and after day about the war. They have to talk about that. Their own, I would say, duty, kind of ethos, to use Weber's terms. They have to talk about it. And if they talk about it, people can understand. When we had, in France, but also in other countries, the chief of staff, the military staff, and the head of intelligence services talking about that.
Yeah.
But there must be, I must say, also more speeches from the presidents or the prime minister, depending on the country, about, what it concretely means. And if people are still saying, okay, what the Russians are doing, that's horrible, they are threats, there is a risk of war, okay, but on the other hand, we will have to build a kind of peace treaty with Russia. At the end of the day, there will be only diplomatic solution, and all these kind of stupid and foolish diplomatic mantras. Then it will be very hard to convince the people and to explain not only that they do have to make some sacrifices regarding, let's say, social safety net or etc., but also that at the end of the day, that will be an asset for them. Because if we are entering concretely, really, into war economy, because that's something that we have to do, and we are not right now in none of the European countries in a war economy system, there will be a lot of benefits for the average citizens in terms of growth, in terms of innovations, in terms of R&D, in terms of competition on realms such as the AI and etc. And I think that if we want to consider Europe a power, in fact, going into war economy will be a huge benefit and of a huge benefit for the European people. So it's not against social warfare. It's not against the people. It's not against growth. It's not against purchasing power, etc. Basically, it will help Europe to be more powerful, but also to be more wealthy. And when you have a wealthy nations, then wealthy nations can offer more in terms also in social safety net, quality of hospitals, quality of schools, etc., to its own people. So we have to change.
It comes down to leadership. You've said it over and over and over again. It's not the people, and you've confirmed what I was asking. It's not the average person in Europe. It's the leadership. We're starting to run out of time, but we still have a few minutes left. I have a couple of follow-up questions, but I want to play another brief clip from you talking about collective guilt. And then I want to follow up with a couple of questions, if that's all right. So just hang with me and let the folks watch a couple of comments that you made on this topic.
I think there is absolutely no possibility, if we want to remain faithful to the principles of Nuremberg, there is no possibility that they escape responsibility. They must be brought to court, and all the Russian criminals, wherever they are, wherever they will be, must be haunted until their last days. I mean, that's something which is a pledge, but that's not something theoretical, because if we are turning a blind eye to the crimes, if we accept there is a kind of amnesty, then I think we are destroying all the principles Europe is basically standing for. And I think you have the basic principles that could be endangered if there is no trial for Putin, but also for all the sponsors of the world and the criminals individually. And then there is something which is even more important, is that the Russian people feel guilty for all the crimes committed on their behalf. There is a philosopher, Karl Jaspers, after World War II, who was speaking about the collective guilt. I says this feeling of collective guilt must haunt the Russian people. They must come to terms with all the crimes that were committed. I remember, I don't know if you remember the speech by President Richard von Weizsäcker, the German president, in 1985, on May 8th, just 40 years after the capitulation of Nazi Germany. He said that fortunately, we've lost the war. Just imagine a Russian president, I don't know if it will happen one day or not, in 40 years from now, saying, well, we were responsible for the crimes, and fortunately, we were defeated on the battlefield.
More. And I don't know if we will ever see the day, but I think the crucial thing that you said in that clip, Nicolas, is that the Russian people have to accept the collective guilt. And I'm going to take it one step further. I believe the people in Western Europe need to start accepting the collective guilt about not supporting Ukraine enough so this war is over, that you and I shouldn't even be having this conversation, because 4 years ago they would have been victorious. But that didn't happen. But let me, you've talked about this quite a bit and quite well. I want to ask you a question. I don't know if it's asked of you a lot or enough. As an American veteran who has fought in combat and who is thoroughly disgusted and embarrassed about the current administration in America, do you see, when you talk to just average people throughout Europe, do you see them believing today that America is now one of their main adversaries in the world?
Well, I will say two things about America. First of all, well, if we are talking about Trump's America, certainly, because Trump's America is basically endangering the security of Europe. By colluding, obviously, with Russia. And of course, we all know, many examples, very concrete examples of this kind of ideological collision. It's not financial collision with Russia. And that there is a full neglect by Trump and Vance and others for international laws. That's part of they call transactional philosophy. Philosophy is a big word for that, but that's certainly, from this point of view, they consider that if we consider two axes, the axis of democracies and the axis of revisionist powers, unfortunately, the US basically has joined the revisionist powers, like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and some others. If we consider then the US as a whole, and even if we consider, let's say we have, Biden, or kind of Biden, not Biden himself, of course, coming back, or Obama coming back, kind of, etc. The question is basically twofold. The first thing is, will they show more, not only solidarity with Europe, but also, I will say, more respect for European principles, values, and stances. I will give you just two examples. When President Biden decided to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan in August 2021, there was absolutely no consultation of the allies. If we consider second examples, Obama, when he decided in 2013 not to enforce the red lines, he was setting himself after the chemical attack by the Syrian regime on the Ghouta. President Hollande at that time was ready to take action. And basically, he was fully, abandoned by the US. Of course, I can give you many other examples, like IRA, which was harming, the European companies, etc., etc. But one of the main questions that we certainly have is, will the US really take action if very concretely one of the European countries is threatened by Russia? And we have the same questions if Taiwan is seriously threatened by China. What will the US do? And I remember I had some talks in Tokyo and Seoul already in 2013, 14, etc. And even at that time, there was a doubt among my Japanese or South Korean colleagues about not the readiness they have, the capabilities they have, but the willingness to take action if there was a concrete threat. So in that sense, of course, the US is not an enemy, but is not a reliable partner. And that's why, I mean, as we were discussing before, Europe has to rearm dramatically, and will have, with the Ukrainian on board, will be a huge asset to be ready to take actions. Even if we take retrospectively the case of Syria, just imagine that the European countries like France, but also the UK, Germany, etc., had the power to take actions against Assad to prevent, I mean, the crimes against humanity on a massive scale committed by Assad regime, and then after with the help of the Iranians and the Russians. The world would have been fully different if in 2014 the Europeans were ready also to take action against Russia after the invasions of part of Donbass and Crimea without any assistance from the US. Russia will have been stopped there, and we will have since thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives. And I think that certainly, and from this point of view, I consider that there is too much, I will say, doubts about the US right now to consider the US a fully trustworthy partner.
Nicolas, do you, from your talks with both the average person in Europe and European leaders, do they feel today with the Trump administration that the United States would not honor Article 5, or do they still have the trust that they will, that the United States will come to their aid if they invoke Article 5?
If you are talking about ordinary people, certainly they do not know. And many of them do not know what's about Article 5, probably.
True.
But when I am considering, I mean, all the private, I mean, behind closed door discussions that I had with some of the European leaders, but also MPs, or European MPs, etc., or senior staffers, no one consider that the US right now will abide by the Article 5. So it's very clear.
So trust is gone with the leadership, and I guess, and you're absolutely right. I mean,
it's fully gone. It's fully gone. I mean,
yeah. The average person doesn't know what Article 5 is, but I think what you're saying, the trust, the European people probably just don't have the trust. Don't believe America would come to their aid. The leaders, you're saying, don't believe that they would, America would not honor Article 5, both of which indicate a total lack of trust.
Yes, absolutely. And then, of course, you have a lot of follow-up questions I want to elaborate on, which is, of course, the questions of NATO, the very existence of NATO,
yes,
the membership of NATO, the questions of, its viability in the long run, and the question how to replace NATO, because we need a kind of NATO organizations, obviously. And I won't criticize, I think, NATO as such, but the question is, if we have the main member states of NATO leaving, who was basically the key, but I mean the very concrete, instrumental, practical key of the Article 5, which is the US, what should we do? And this question was, in fact, posed very openly, you remember, after the first day of his mandate by Chancellor Merz. And I think he was right, of course, to ask the questions.
Do you see NATO surviving in its current form, or do you see NATO reforming with, and I hate to use the expression, the nations or the willing, whatever they want to call that, the coalition of the willing? Do you see a new NATO, whatever it's called, with major nations such as France, the UK, Germany, and possibly Canada, forming a European collective European defense pact outside of NATO? Or do you see NATO in its current form somehow getting its act together and surviving?
Well, I mean, of course, it will depend of what comes, in the US in the 2028 election. Of course, that's a part of the answer, obviously. But even with that, even if we have a new, I will say, reasonable president elected, either Democratic or Republican, there must be no, I will say, comfort from the Europeans. Because, as I said, let's imagine that we had an attack on Estonia in 2021 under President Biden. What would have President Biden decided? So it's not only Trump. Of course, Trump is worse, because Trump basically, is siding with the dark side of the force. But even with President Biden or President Obama, you had a real question mark. So I do not know exactly what will NATO become. Can we duplicate NATO? Can we reform NATO? Can we have NATO without the US? And my fear is, when it comes to NATO right now, is not that the US will withdraw from NATO. Not only it's probably impossible because of the law passed by the Congress before Obama came to Trump came to power, but is to have NATO sabotage from within, which is maybe a bigger risk. Because if we have still the US in NATO and just making quite difficult or even impossible from NATO to transform itself into a kind of new organization, that will be more harmful than just to think about another organization without the US.
Well, let me just make one more point, and then we are out of time. In reference to your thoughts, your point about whether or not Biden or Obama would have come to the aid of Europe should Estonia have been attacked by Russia, if Russian troops had crossed the Narva River and gotten into Estonia in Eastern Europe, would either Obama or Biden have come to their aid? No one will know the answer to that. I personally would like to think that they would have, that we would have sent U.S. troops into Estonia, into the Baltics to defend them. But no one will know for sure. What I do know is that it's been a plan of Trump's, if one can say that Trump even has plans past what he's eating for breakfast. I believe that he's wanted to get out of NATO for a very, very long time. He feels that they've been very unfair to the United States. That's a whole other episode I don't want to get into. I personally don't believe, Nicolas, that NATO is going to survive in its current configuration for a number of reasons. It not just the United States withdrawing, or at least withdrawing its support, but it's imploding. It's imploding now, and I believe it will develop into a coalition of the willing. Again, I don't like that term, but with the major, strongest nations of Europe forming a different kind of European collective defense. I believe that may even be stronger than it was before if it's done right, but we shall wait and see. I don't even know if the United States elections here in this November and in 2028 are going to be legitimate. I really don't. There's so many problems here, as you know. I don't know that it's going to be a legitimate, lawful election. So that's a whole range of other problems for us and Europe. But I'm going to have to leave it there. Nicolas Tenzer, geopolitical analyst extraordinaire. You can see him all over the internet and social media every day. He speaks at conferences. He's on podcasts. He writes on his own Substack. I encourage everyone to look up Nicolas Tenzer. It will be worth your while. Nicolas, thanks a lot. And I want to speak to you again very soon.
Thank you so much, David, for your time. It was a great pleasure again to talk to you. Thank you.
Again, same here, and thank you very much. And to all of you, you all take care, stay safe, stay sane, and look out for the next Dictators on Monday at this same time, which is 3 p.m. UK time, and about an hour later over on the continent. So until then, you all take care.